Welcome to Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into tree and plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Skoff. Today is a very exciting day because we have a fellow podcast creator here talking about the importance of communication as a trait to have or to develop in STEM careers. So welcome to the show, Matt Candeias, the creator of Indefensive Plants.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Matt, I know you're currently a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, go alumni, and an esteemed host and writer of the podcast and blog Indefensive Plants, as Jess just mentioned. We're so excited to talk with you about all of these things. We're huge fans and followers of the podcast and blog, but we want also to give our listeners an opportunity to get to know a little bit about you before we dive into the wonderful world of plants and all your work with them. So with that, we have three things, and they all connect to you somehow. If you could talk a little bit about each of them and how they related to you. So with that, tell us a bit about seeds, or maybe germinating seeds, filmmaking, and frog calls.
Okay. So seeds, I'm a plant nut, and anyone that likes plants knows that seeds come into the picture at some point. Sorry for my spore-bearing friends out there, but I love growing plants. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I'll never get tired of seeing a seed germinate. You know, all the building blocks and blueprints to build an organism are packed into these little things, and trying to figure out how to germinate them is always a fun challenge. I think it's one of the most important skills humanity's ever developed, so I love seeds and I love working with them. Filmmaking, within the last few years, have taken up doing some short documentary films about plants with my good buddy Grant of New Orchid Productions, and that's been a really interesting learning experience. I think it's been an important professional experience for me in terms of being able to feel comfortable with eyes on me and kind of shooting off the hip from what I'm trying to say. Might happen today. But and then frog calls, that's fun. I for a little bit was helping out on a frog call monitoring project on the Niagara River, which is technically a strait, but it was really cool to be out in a canoe doing science, looking for these little amphibians. If it wasn't for plants, I'd probably be doing some sort of amphibian work, I think. I love frogs and salamanders and newts. So being able to be out in this weird situation, one of those moments where you're like, oh, I'm doing something useful here and I'm really enjoying every moment of it, was just such a cool experience.
For someone who's maybe not as familiar with why you would monitor frog calls, can you give a little bit more insight as to what we learn from, tracking them in a given season and listening for different species emergence over time?
Sure. Yeah, that article just came out about, amphibian extinctions, like one of the worst things this planet's experiencing right now. It's horrific. So knowing who's out there is like the first step to knowing when things are going wrong or what needs to be done. And so the great thing about frogs and toads is that, like birds, you don't necessarily have to see them. They can kind of be hard to find, but if you time it just right, you can know when they're coming out. You listen, you can identify species, relative abundance, that sort of stuff. So it's a really easy way, I guess, in so many. I mean, it's not easy. It's definitely challenging, but it's a lot easier than having to go out and find individual frogs and count them.
And it also, provides really unique opportunities, like you were saying, like being out in a canoe and going to these, remote locations. Can you talk a little bit about, you've got such a great background with all these different experiences. What's been your favorite moment?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I've been extremely fortunate to have a lot of opportunities. Bird banding is always cool because birds are so flitty and hard to focus on, and get binocular neck looking up for them. But when you're doing bird banding, you're helping with conservation, again, knowing who's there, how many roughly, and just being able to kind of interact with something that you rarely get to see a good glimpse of. Yeah, that's always like a mind-blowing experience for me. I could talk about plant ones too, but some of those might be a little more obvious.
And bird banding, why don't you describe what that is for our listener?
Yeah, they set up these nets. They're like these big volleyball nets that are really fine, and they put them in different locations. You can do them in the forest, you can do them in fields, and you just wait a certain amount of time, and then you go, and the birds can't see them really well. They fall into them. They get kind of tangled up. Generally doesn't hurt them. You got to have some skills and practice doing this stuff before you really go out and get hands-on with it. But you get them, take them out of the net, you weigh them, take all these measurements on them, see if there's any sort of signs of breeding, and then you put a little band around their leg. And then if they show up, say, in Ontario, you know where that bird came from, or at least where it's been and that sort of stuff. So it's a really cool way to, again, give back to the science of conservation and, have fun doing it.
Very cool. We're excited to learn more about, all the ways that your learning and writing has kind of brought you to where you are now. So with that, why don't we get started?
Sure.
A lot of the work that you do with your podcast and your blog, it's working to help combat against plant blindness, which is the idea that, people see just green. They don't see the individual plants and how amazing they are for not only humans, but other animals, other plants, and what they contribute to the world. So has this something have you always been cured of plant blindness, or was that something that you were afflicted with when you were younger?
Oh, yeah. I was an animal person till relatively later in, my life. I guess I'm not that old anyway. But, yeah, I was an animal person. I liked charismatic megafauna, predators. I thought I wanted to work with, big cats for a while. But really fish kind of took a lot of my attention. I was into aquariums. And so that's really what I thought I wanted to do. I wanted to go into fisheries or zoology, some related to that. And then I went to a fishery and smelled it, and I'm very squeamish, and I realized that was not going to work for me. But even then, that was not how it switched. I mean, the aquariums helped because I realized I didn't want to do the brightly colored gravel with the little pineapple statue anymore. I wanted to give these organisms a sense of they're in the real world. They're not in some weird little curated, curious thing. And so I kind of got introduced to growing plants that way because I would look for plants that were indigenous to that region and say, okay, I can bring those in. It didn't make me like plants anymore. I think I paid attention, some are different than others sort of deal. But after the whole fishery debacle crashed and burned for me, my friend's dad said, it sounds like you're really into ecology. You might want to start looking at that as a series of coursework that you should probably take. And it made so much sense at that point because it was organisms don't operate in a vacuum. I'm not going to just be doing dissections all the time or working in a lab, which not necessarily for me, although I realize a lot of people do like that. I wanted to learn how organisms interact and evolve and that sort of stuff. And so I got really into ecology, but even then it was still animal-focused, and conservation started really coming on board, and I realized I really wanted to do something for conservation. There's all these species that need our help, probably need less of our help sometimes too, but it even then didn't really click. But the more I got into, I was working at a quarry and doing some habitat restoration work for them. And the more I got into that, the more I realized that if we want anything approaching a healthy ecosystem, plants really have to be the start of that. And if it wasn't for plants, that most of these things I really valued wouldn't be there. And so I went, I should start at least paying attention to plants as part of this whole spectrum of things I need to care about. But then I started really researching plants, and the more I dove into that, the more I realized just how amazing these organisms really are. And if you think about it, they have all of the building blocks that make us work and tick. Every living thing on this planet has the same thing, but they're so alien, right? They're these sessile things that take energy from our nearest star and turn that into food, and then they need, third parties, whether that be wind or an organism of some sort, to have sex. How weird is that? And so those sorts of realizations made me go, I've ignored plants for way too long, and here's it's almost like you read the last chapter of a book and you went, I've been missing all of this up until this point. And so I went all in. I started reading more and more and more about plants, and that switch slowly just flipped, and it's been plants ever since.
I love listening to you kind of talk about that switch flipping, because I know also until you realize that plants, are really long-lived and they don't move. So they have to have really creative ways to get what they need and survive. And once you start to realize that, you start to notice all of the adaptations across all of the things that have been in your backyard the whole time.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, it sounds like, at some point you kind of had a little bit of a transition where you kind of made that jump from plants to animals. A lot of our listeners are high school students. So when you were back in high school, what did you think you were going to be growing up? Or kind of, walk us through kind of when that switch when that switch was flipped.
Yeah, high school Matt was an awkward fella. I, for a while, thought I was going to be a rock star. I'm from Buffalo, and a lot of great bands came from Buffalo. Okay. We were not one of those bands. It was embarrassing, and I'm happy that never really came to fruition. And then, I thought maybe zoology or something like that. Again, all of this plant stuff happened almost towards the end of my undergraduate career. So I think more than anything, I just went in knowing I loved biology and I loved the natural world and just tried to take coursework that focused on that to some extent. So, for better or for worse, I got a pretty strong biology education. Yeah.
Well, I know that you should feel a little bit like a rock star because I was talking to some of my colleagues and friends that I was interviewing you, and they were jealous. So you should feel a little bit like a rock star. So, you're currently a Ph.D. candidate. What has your educational journey been up to this point?
A long one. No, like I said, I realized towards the end of my undergraduate career that I was going to switch gears pretty strongly there and start pursuing different things. So finished up, was pretty burnt out with school, worked for a few years, which was the best thing I could have done. I guess we can touch on that later. But I decided that, plants and conservation really were going to be my focus after a while. And that kind of took me along the lines of like, okay, what does it take to get species to germinate? Why don't we see plants growing everywhere? Why are some species really rare and other species are super common? Those sorts of things. And so really my educational career has been sort of focused along the lines of trying to figure out how we can fill those gaps about the unknowns in terms of what plants require for survival and persistence, but also really coming to the realization in the last few years that maybe doing science isn't for me. And that's good to know. I think it's really important to know what you don't want just as much as what you do want. And as much as I've enjoyed the process, the journey's been great. And I've learned a lot, and it's taught me how to read science and interpret science. I think the career now for me is shifting more towards the communication side of thing, not necessarily like a strictly educational standpoint, but just working really hard on a lot of different ways of getting people super excited about plants.
I'm curious. I know we mentioned a little bit that you're a PhD candidate. Can you talk a little bit about your current research and your PhD program?
Yeah, I'm really focused again on conservation, and I tried to keep it broad too in a theoretical sense. So I think a lot about how plant communities come together, how they assemble, what structures them, like what are the major drivers of why we see plants on this side of the mountain and not this side of the mountain? Why do we see plants at this elevation and not this? That sort of thing, but also kind of couching that in this big overwhelming force that's changing our planet now and is going to continue to do so at an alarming rate, which is climate change and this idea that a lot of plants can't get up and move, right? And they have to move or migrate generationally, and we've carved up habitat like crazy. And so a lot of plants are going to have a really hard time getting to new areas and surviving the rates at things that are changing. And so my big focus of my research is trying to figure out how well plants can do when things change really quick. And that's it's been a lot of work.
You mentioned that while you have really enjoyed the process of research, you're really being drawn more towards communication. And I think that's evident with your amazing podcast, the blog, all of that. Can we talk a little bit about why you think it's important to communicate information about plants? And, I hate the term soft skill. I think I hate it, but we're going to use it right now. Why do you think communication is an important soft skill to develop?
Sure. I'll take the second one first just because I think it lends well to the first question. I mentioned I worked in a quarry, and I was the environmental person at the quarry, which was not a favored position by any means. And I grew up in a really rural area, and I've always kind of been the nerd that I am today. And so I learned throughout all of those experiences that you really do need to learn how to talk to people that don't think like you. It's really easy to get into the bubble and like, I only want to hear things that I want to hear, and nothing else. But that's not good, right? Because there's how many billion people on this planet, and we really need to cross those aisles a lot better. And so I think communication is like the most fundamental thing humans do. Whether that's the written word or the spoken word or anything in between, like we communicate, and we do it better than or more technically than any other organism on this planet. So like embrace that, right? Use these skills and just learn how to talk to people, especially learn how to talk to people that don't think like you. Talk to people that challenge your ideas. Talk to people that are opposed to your ideas and learn from those experiences. Don't just get frustrated and walk away. Like learning what you might have done wrong in your communication, because really if someone's not getting it, like my old advisor used to say, it's like it's kind of on you, really, to make your message clear, right? And don't take that to heart, just learn from it. And so that, I think, is so underrated across a lot of careers, but especially in the sciences, because we have kind of turned it into this capitalistic enterprise of like, get the funding, write the grant, get the funding, write the paper, get it into this journal that no one outside of that little realm reads, and which is fine. That's how the process works. But what does that mean for the people that then go on to do the voting, go on to donating money to these causes that really then go on to fund the research? Like, we have to learn how to talk and get other people excited and learn new ways of doing that, and trying to step out of your comfort zone in terms of the way you talk about things and think about the world, to try and find new ways to connect to people. And so in thinking about plants and communicating why I think it's important to communicate about plants is, like I said, like, we wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for plants. And plants get the short shrift because they are talked about generally in the terms of like folklore or herbalism or those sorts of deals, which is fine. Like, I'm happy when people get interested no matter what, but that's covering such a small fraction of the plants that make the world function and pretty much form the backbone of all ecosystems on this planet. And so without communicating why plants are important just because they're there, because they evolved there and that they're functioning as some component of this giant working machine that is the living biosphere, without that, what do we have, right? So I think trying to get people excited about plants for more than just their utility is super important, at least from my perspective, obviously.
Well, you're in shared company.
Yeah.
Jessica and I feel the exact same way, and we're huge listeners and lovers of the podcast In Defense of Plants, as well as the blog. And I know, I follow you on Instagram also to watch, all the things that you're growing. But I'm curious, kind of knowing that it has, a couple different ways that you communicate information on plants. There's a lot of different modes that you do that. Did the blog come first? Did the podcast come first? Did one lead to the other? Can you talk a little bit about the evolution in those different ways that you communicate in order to reach your audience?
I started off with the blog first. It was all through writing. I was working at a job where I was trying to put together these little packets of like, we're going to do some native plantings, and here's the plant species, and here's why we're planting them. And I was charged with writing those, and I was like, oh, that's actually kind of fun. It's a way of taking a lot of different types of information, a lot of different sources, and kind of combining them into this little story about a species, which it's always incomplete. We're always going to learn more, but that to me is a really fun challenge and an experience to do. It's like getting to know someone, but it's getting to know an organism and trying to build on what others have learned about it. And so I was unemployed. I needed some outlet for my energy and a lot of a focus. So I was like, all right, I read a handful of blogs. Those seem fun. I think I have some things to say. And so I just started writing about them, and it, started slow. I did a few things. I don't know, maybe my mom read one, or a couple of friends sort of thing. But then, through the magic that is social media, I just started going into these different forums and these different plant pages and just being like, oh, hey, bet you never looked at Mayapple this way before. And then, a few good shares later, and suddenly people are chiming in, and I'm getting to interact with people from different parts of the country. And then it grew a little bit more in different parts of the world. And I'm going like, oh, there's a thirst for this sort of content. People really want to interact. But also, like, this is really cool because here I am. I was in my early 20s at the time, sitting in a tiny little bedroom in my pajamas, right? And I'm reaching people, and that's really cool. So it just kind of like built its own momentum. And then after a few years of that, I was like, look, I love talking. I'm a blabbermouth, and I like having good conversations. So it's like really what I want to do on a Friday night is just like sit down and have good conversations with people. And I was in grad school at the time, and it just made sense to like sit down. And instead of not recording our conversations that my friends and I were having, I would just put my phone down and use the voice memo feature to just record some banter about plants or hikes and stuff like that. And that was really cool. And at first it was just kind of like, oh, this will be the format. I'll just be with my friends or maybe some plant people that I know, and we'll just talk about that. But then it's like, oh, I'm in a department full of people researching ecology and plants, so let's force them to sit down and talk with me. And so it just kind of, again, snowballed from there. And I was lucky that the blog had some attention because it was easy to be like, hey, if you like this, you might also like this other thing I'm trying. And so it just ballooned. And again, having that base was really helpful because then it was a lot of people being like, oh, I've been looking for a podcast like this. And that's what was nice, too, is I'd listened to a few nature-themed podcasts, but there wasn't really anything like plant-centric that wasn't gardening or herbalism. And I was like, okay, well, there's a niche, so let's try to fill that. And then here I am.
I'm kind of curious, just because you highlight so many different species or families. How do you And I'm sure there's a creative process involved, but how do you come up with new episode topics, or how do you pick, it's hard. If you're passionate about plants, there's a lot to choose. How do you, how do you focus on a new episode topic, or how do you choose?
Constantly reading different things. I'll pick up a gardening book and read about a cool plant or something like that, or I'm in a grad school for a lot of years now, and so I'm constantly reading papers, and there's, the ones that really stand out. I'm like, oh, well, there's an email attached to this. Turns out a lot of people are just starving for outlets to actually share their views of the world or their research with. And so it's not that hard to find. It is hard to narrow my focus, like you said, or pick topics, but really it's kind of like flavor of the week. I mean, I got really into conifers recently, so I reached out to a ton of gymnosperm people just to see who would bite, and a few have. So stay tuned. And then what's great too is like that network really starts to build. And so like every person that I have on shares it with their group of cohorts or whatever colleagues. And so you start getting people like, oh, I enjoyed that. You would also enjoy talking to my friend who does this. And so sometimes I'll get recommendations. I get a lot of them. Not all of them end up coming to fruition, but it's also really cool to have people reach out and say like, oh, I'm working on this. Would you ever be interested? And being that it is I get to pick and choose what I want to learn about that week. Because really, I mean, it's very selfish in that it's like I get to learn. So
I think it's great because it also, we're touching on the fact, which is an important part of communication, is networking. And you're building up your own personal network, you're connecting others, and I think it's something that's really beneficial for our listeners to understand. If you're beginning your career, look around the people that not only your friends, your colleagues, your classmates, they might be people who down the line you can be working on really great projects with. But other people, reach out. You've got, I think last season we talked about you have the student card. You have the opportunity to email somebody and be like, hey, I would like to talk about your work. And so use those networks, build them, and that's an important part of communication.
Big time. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, learn to talk to a lot of different people. You never know when something might come up or, something useful might happen. And you never know who's in charge of that. I think every good thing that's happened in my life has been like 9 parts serendipity. So, it's very hard to plan things out sometimes.
Well, and speaking of, your networking, you have a couple of collection of In Defense of Plants documentary shorts. And can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
that's been really fun, totally unexpected experience. I'm very uncomfortable in front of the camera, despite how it looks. But yeah, my friend Rachel and I are in the same program. She's since graduated, got her Ph.D. and is at a great postdoc position in Minnesota. So congrats, Rachel.
Go, Rachel.
But her husband would come to these social events, and he was always kind of like the media guy in a sea of really nerdy scientists that just kind of wanted to get drunk and complain about their research on the weekends. And I'm not into like the pity party misery, like let's brag about how much work we're doing this week. Like I was just like, it's Friday, I don't want to talk about this stuff. So it's like Grant and I realized we really like the same music. We have the same irreverent sense of humor. So we just ended up really getting along. And he does media stuff. And at his old position, he was doing good work, but it was not allowing him a lot of creative freedom. And so he wanted to expand his portfolio into more educational stuff. And he's like, I've listened to some of like the hiking podcasts that you've done, and I think we could turn that into something visual. Plants are a visual entity. Like, it's really fun to look at them. It's fun to kind of see where they're at, especially in the context of, like, the environments that they're in. And so he said, would you ever be interested? And I was like, no, I don't want to be on front of camera. But it took some, maybe an extra drink or two and some convincing. But he's like, look, no pressure. We'll just have fun with it. We'll go outside and just see what we can find. And I was like, okay, let's give it a shot. And so we did, and it was very uncomfortable. It was a very cold day. It was fun. I mean, we had a blast doing it. We saw cool things, but it was nothing I thought was going to come of that looked good. And then, through his creative genius, he sent me the rough cut of what he had done. And I was like, you got that out of what we just did? There's something here, and you're really, I had fun doing it, and I really like what you're doing. You don't make me look stupid, too, which is also good. And you've got a sense of creativity that I think is sorely needed. And so we just decided to give it a shot. And so we were doing a lot of shorts week by week. We just go like, he goes, oh, what are you doing Thursday night? You want to go out and see what's out there? And so we just head out to the woods somewhere or the prairie, film something, and then it just kind of built and built and built. And then one day we're like, let's do something longer. Let's see if we can kickstart something. And so we kickstarted the Cascades project and got to go out to Portland thanks to everyone that supported us. And so it's been really fun, really cool experience. And I like doing them. I don't still not comfortable being in front of the camera or seeing I can't watch myself. It's so cringy, but yeah, it's been a really cool experience, and I'm really thankful for Grant, pushing me into that.
Very cool. And it's something that we'll definitely also link to in our bonus content as well, so that
Bonus content.
so that listeners can check that out as well. We've talked a lot about communication, different channels for communication, different ways to network and communication. One piece that we haven't touched upon yet, which is pretty critical, is audience. So can you tell us a little bit about how speaking to your audience plays into your work, about who the audience is for the In Defense of Plants brand, the many offshoots that it has, video, podcast, Instagram, blog, and how you use that kind of feedback to kind of drive what you're doing?
Sure. I love my audience, for the record. I mean, I've gotten to interact with so many cool people, so many knowledgeable people.
Including us.
Yes, exactly. I know. This is exactly what I'm talking. I mean, it's like I get to do these sorts of things, which is great. And, the internet is full of terrible people too, and I get those, but it's rare. So yeah, I've got a really good audience. It's kind of hard to really put a finger on who's listening or who's reading. I don't Facebook stalk everyone that comments on my stuff, and the metrics only get you so far. But I originally set out to do this for scientists. I was like, I'll make this that's scientists want to read it and listen to it, which is good because it really forced me to understand what I was reading, communicate what I was doing as accurately as possible, and that was really fun. But then I started to realize, no, these people are already on board. It's cool that they're enjoying it. I want them to enjoy it, but that's really not who I want to target. Who I want to target and who I love hearing from the most, and I do hear from these people from time to time, which is really great, are people that say, I never really liked plants until I started listening to this, or I thought plants were boring and now I know they're not. Or the best one that I got recently was someone that said, I heard you on your friend's podcast and I don't like plants. I never really gardened, but now I'm ripping up my front lawn and putting in a garden. That to me was
so cool.
Win. I've done it.
Great.
And so now I think when I go into anything I put out, it's not dumbing it down because the public is not stupid.
Yes.
They are starving for good information. People want to learn. And that's what's really annoying about this is a lot of people want to dumb their science down or try to get it into this really safe little box, and you're just robbing people of really cool information. People want this stuff. They want to learn. They just don't want to be told what to do, how to feel. I want to inspire people. I don't want to lecture people.
Yeah.
I go to enough lectures, right? And so now it's just how can I find ways to get people inspired about plants? How can I reach that person that, maybe now instead of walking to their bus or going to their car in the morning and just getting in and going about their day is stopping and going, oh, I never noticed that plant growing by the driveway, or now I drive down the highway and I see 4 different types of trees, or at least they look different, right?
Yeah.
And that's to me really where I'm trying to go with this. And I think we get so wrapped up into what's the proper way of communicating this, when in reality I think it's how do we just get people fired up? Because, at the end of the day, a lot of people just don't need to think about this stuff or can't have the time to think about this sort of stuff. And as long as they care a little bit, I think I've done my job. I hope.
Well, we recently had a workshop on site with teachers, and we showed them your profile, which is available in our bonus content. And we asked them what they would want to know from you. And one of the things that came up is, you're in grad school, Ph.D. candidate, but you also, very prolific blog, podcast. How do you have it all?
How do you balance your time?
Yeah.
I thought that was clear. But all right.
I'm going to catch a lot of flack for saying this, but I don't find time management in grad school to be difficult at all. Not to say it's not a challenge. Grad school is definitely a challenge. It's something you probably should want before you dive into it. But in terms of workload and managing time, it's not an issue for me.
Advisor specific.
Yes, yeah. Also, the advisor makes a big difference too, and that's where I think communication early on goes a long way. But for me, the best thing I did was take time off and work a lot of jobs I really liked and a lot of jobs I really hated. And you learn a lot of perspective on what the working world is like. In a 9-to-5 job, most times you don't really have the luxury of walking away and doing anything other than what you're there to do, no matter how much time it takes. And so, again, communicating well with the potential advisors early on and picking people that I think I'd work well with and people that really appreciate a self-starter sort of attitude, kind of, we have a deadline we have to hit. As long as you're getting that deadline met, I don't care what you do with your hours during the day. And that's been really great for me because I am not the type that can work 100% on one thing at any given time. I can work for maybe an hour or two on this, and then I'll go, oh, I'm going to read a paper that's not related to what I'm doing, and that's where I find the time to do it. And I think it's really helped me in the long run, too, is another perspective to bring to this is if you're going into grad school, the way science works nowadays is it's like you narrow that focus, you get into that field, and you know that field inside and out, which is necessary, but it also robs you of a lot of other great things going on in the world. And so this, to me, is my way of branching out and at least opening the doors to other ideas and other realms of science, and especially botany-related stuff that I wouldn't be doing necessarily. But it's also given me a lot of great things for my own work. You know, a lot of things about the way plants grow or the techniques used to grow them or just how they change and how they respond. Like, it's teaching me, which makes my science better in the long run. So I think it's a skill that, like, given the good communication that you can have with your working advisor and really how you manage your day can really help you in the long run.
It's great to listen to you kind of touch upon a lot of things that were themes from last season, that it's really important to, take the experiences that you have and learn from them, the good and the bad. So sometimes, any opportunity that you get to do, you're going to take something away and then immediately apply it to the next situation you're in, even if you don't know that it's something that you're doing. But that you can learn from both things that you like and things that you don't, and things that if you're really passionate about it, if you really just, want more, it's not necessarily going to feel like work. You can find ways to merge passions, the things you really like to do, into things that you're currently doing. If you're into photography and science, there's ways to bring them together. If you're into reading and writing about science, you can bring that into whatever else it is you're doing. So I think those are it's great to hear you touch upon those themes because it's things that we have heard from other guests as well.
So check out season 1.
There was also a lot of interest from our teachers and feedback from the audience as to kind of where you came up with. I mean, based on our conversation, I have a pretty good guess. But can you talk a little bit about how you developed the name for In Defense of Plants and kind of how you arrived at that title?
Yeah, it's a kind of a two-parter, then perfect storm that all kind of happened at the same time that I was starting this effort up. And the first part of it was that obsessive component of my brain. Like, I'm either all in or just kind of like, eh. Mm-hmm. And plants for me were all in. But when I go all in, I want to know what I want to know. And sometimes that stuff can be really hard to find, especially with plants, because like I said, when you hear people, generally speaking, talking about plants, it's folklore, medicinal value, gardening, permaculture, those sorts of things, which are fine. Like, I'm not downplaying those at all, but for me, that was not enough. It was not about how humans use plants. I don't care how they do, as long as they're not hurting them. I want to know about their biology. I want to know how they evolved, where they came from, the biogeography. It's like an origin story, as my friend Joey always says. It's like learning about the world and how life came to be, and like plants are just another way of doing that. And so it was kind of a defense in that way of being like, no, plants are also interesting organisms too. They're living, breathing, reproducing, fighting organisms. They're not these static backdrops to more charismatic, movable things. They're fascinating. And what's even cooler is they take energy from our nearest star and turn it into food. I mean, they make this planet what it is. And we need to celebrate that, because if you're just talking about the way humans use plants, you're talking about the smallest fraction of plant life out there. And so I wanted to just fill somewhat that niche. But then the other half of it was I was working for a not-for-profit in Buffalo, which no names need to be mentioned, but it was something I went in really excited about because I was doing streamside riparian restoration work and coordinating volunteers to do these really great high-focus projects. Yeah. And it's an organization that cares about water quality, and plants filter water for free. I mean, having healthy riparian buffers is one of the best things you can do for water quality. And they just didn't care. And it was like in meetings, they'd be like, oh, you plant people. And I'm like, wait a minute. You should all be on board 100% with this instead of looking at us. It was just more about like, well, how do we get a nice picture in the newspaper and get that next grant? It wasn't about, restoring some ecological function to a very degraded system in Buffalo. It was really disheartening, but it fired me up. And I don't regret it for a minute, because it's one of those situations where you're like, again, I think someone needs to stand up and bang on the table. And like, I wasn't going to do that and get fired, but I could go on the internet and I could tell stories and hopefully, again, get people inspired so that the next person that gets one of those high up positions at a place like that doesn't go, oh, you plant people. They go, no, we need plant people.
Oh, you plant people?
Yeah. So, I'm a plant defender, and that's really,
So as a defender of all plants, I have one very hard and last question for you, and I'll let you group it to a whole family so you don't have to choose just one. But this is something that we ask all of our guests, even though it's a tough question. But what is your favorite plant?
It's the tables have turned. I usually do this to my guests, and now I know how it feels. I'm sorry, everyone. No, I had to go the family level with this because to pick one, it's like, okay, what time of day is it? Sort of situation. But I love orchids. They weren't my gateway necessarily into botany, but when I really started going all in and started growing them, it made me realize just how much there is out there. They're the largest family of plants in the world, depending on how the asters are doing that week and who needs a dissertation, lumping, splitting. But unlike the asters, which generally you see an aster, you know where it's fitting in. Like orchids are so bizarre. They're living in the trees. They're living on the ground. They're living underground. Some of them are parasites. Some of them are vines. Like there's just something for everyone. And then when you start getting into like ecological interactions, I mean, their pollination methods are just out of this world, so foreign to anything. And like some are so stupid specific, like the hammer orchid in Australia that mimics a female wasp and it needs the male to think he's mating with her or trying to carry her away. And he just is like bashing his head into this sort of thing. It's bizarre. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with orchids. So there's always something there to teach us about evolution, ecology. And like they're the poster children for like, all of the parts matter because they don't germinate without fungus. They need specific fungus. They need specific pollinators. Yeah. Like they are a holistic view of just how important these ecosystems really are as holistic pieces rather than just these tiny components that we get excited about.
And speaking of holistic, I think it's just great how you have a really holistic approach to your science, to plants by making sure you're bringing it to the people and you're making it accessible. You do a fantastic job on your podcast, on your blog.
Thank you.
Just, making it not even making it, just presenting it so people are aware of how amazing the world of plants really is. So thank you so much for being here. You're a fantastic communicator, and we feel really lucky that you're here today.
Oh, thanks. It's an honor to be interviewed by you both. I really appreciate the opportunity.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/Planted Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share, and let us know what you think. This is Jessica Turner-Skoff
and Megan Wiesbrod,
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.